Once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will always have a live chat on the first Friday of the month at 8 p.m. So please subscribe, click on the bell, and let's get 1,000 subscribers very soon. Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Mexico was colonized by England. Mexico was a Spanish colony, and before that Mexico had a very complicated and diverse political, linguistic, as well as religious and cultural landscape. Mexico was never truly united as it is nowadays. Before that, only merchants maybe had contact between the one point and the other point of the country. And then there was also Teotihuacan, where many people from all across of Mexico like to go in there for religious purposes, but a Mexican unity never really existed in those times. Spain already set foot on the Caribbean, so coming to Mexico was the next logical step. But what if this never happened? What if instead of Spain, England colonized Mexico? First of all, we need to find a very good point of divergence. But I must be honest with you guys, I was very struggling to find a good point of divergence. So there are many things that would come up. One would be such as having no Spain or Spain being part of England, but this point of divergence would mess up with too many things. So let's just say that the English secretly sailed across the Atlantics, and they were a few years before Columbus in the Americas. They would set up a base in Northern America, but focus mostly on the area of Mexico, because there they would find a huge amount of wealth and of course gold. Fast forward, the Spanish would be surprised to see that they were not the first to find the route towards India, of course. And they would see that the English were already in there. Well, the next thing that would happen is that Spain would most likely postpone the invasion of the Incan Empire, and it would make it much harder later on to conquer the united Incan Empire, because there would not be a civil war. Let's just pretend that this doesn't happen and the Spanish, they are still able to colonize South America as they did in OTL. Mexico, of course, would not just be called Mexico. Which name could the English choose? Well, I would say one idea would be New England, or they would choose a name of an emperor, so why not call it Henry Land? A very cool sounding name, right? Yeah, sorry to offend you, dear Mexicans. West India might also be applied at first, but after finding out that the Americas would be an independent continent on its own, they would probably drop that name. North America had an English port, and that port would still be used by the English for a certain time, but the rest of Northern America remains pretty much on its own. Much of the population of the Americas will still die due to the illnesses spread by the European, and instead of having slaves in Northern America, most of the slaves would be deported to today's Mexico. Now, another important change is that without the Spanish caste system, the English would establish a society somewhat similar as in the US, but also with many more differences within that society. And there would be many differences as well, because first of all, the population of Mexico was much higher than the one of the US before the English came. So these peoples won't be killed or deported, but at first be at odds with the white English population. Some could mix with the English, and some would mix with the escaped slaves later on. Moreover, some parts could have a higher percentage of native populations, which would at one point or another have some power. A similar system as the Brits had in India could be established. However, it would just be partially established. Due to the fact that there are still a lot of natives, getting a white majority is almost impossible. Mexico was demographically different than the US, Canada, or Australia, and also the idea of giving some powers to the natives was not something that the English would just do out of sympathy, but out of necessity. So they would really need to give power to the elite of the natives. The natives would outnumber the English for many years to come. This new Mexican society would be very classist, as England was, of course, but also racist towards the slaves especially, and the natives, they would not suddenly start to have sympathies for the slaves, because let's be honest, in here the natives, they would also see the slaves as low or lower than them, and probably many natives would buy or have slaves of their own. So the slaves in this timeline would work in mines and later on also on fields. But first of all, they would primarily work in the mines, and thus there would be a higher concentration of black population in the areas where you have mountains or places where you can dig stuff out of mines. Most whites, they would logically live in the eastern part of Mexico and establish many port cities. What happens to the area of the OTLs, US and Canada? Well, the French, the Dutch and the Scandinavian could get there and found some colonies. Canada would be known as Quebec in our timeline, and the Dutch would have a colony called New Amsterdam, and the Scandinavians would also be able to have a more substantial colony. England would still have a few tiny colonies in Northern America, but they would just exist for supply and also for trade purposes. Spain could be able to take Florida and expand from there on more towards Mississippi, and share later on the border with France, Quebec, and England, Mexico. With so many players in the Americas, I think there would be more colonial wars than in OTL, and if the English colonized Mexico, there is a high chance that they would also have expanded towards California because of the gold, and with that expansion many slaves would be sent in there. England would border Russia, who might have an enlarged Alaskan colony for some time until they would probably sell it off or to the French, or maybe they would not sell it off at all. But let's just assume that the French would have some money, or they would just get a steal on it and get a much larger Quebec. New England or Henryland or Mexico would never really have the same fate as the US or Canada. We would not see the same spirit as the US has, and even if persecuted people from England or Europe would flee to Mexico, you would have a mosaic of different peoples and social classes, which would never truly become a melting pot. A revolution could happen in Europe, and even if France would pull off, like, I don't know, that they would suddenly conquer most of Europe, Britain would be able to take advantage of it and could protect or even expand the borders of their colonies, while the Dutch would probably lose all of it or see it reduced, and the French would have troubles to defend their colonies. Britain would not take all of Quebec or Alaska from France, but they would be able to take a lot of it. And this would mainly be because of the supply lines, and also there was no real infrastructure, and thus it's impossible to just come in and take everything. Quebec would not break from France, but serve as a safe haven for royalists or even the monarchy if there is a revolution. And the Spanish colonies would break away as in OTL, including this time Florida, who would get all supported by Britain. India could still get controlled by Britain because they would not spread too thin and have enough room for expansion. and without the US and Canada, this is most likely the case. The Americas would, for the most part, be in their sphere of influence, except for the very north and maybe Brazil. There is also a slim possibility that Brazil might still be Portuguese, as Portugal was Britain's ally, and they would prefer to have an ally controlling Brazil. And thus, British forces might help the Portuguese to keep control of Brazil. Fast forward, Mexico, New England or Henryland would struggle to find a common identity. You would have the whites, the First Nations, a term that is used in Canada, and the African descendants, because there would not really be the term of Afro-American. All of them, they would be at odds. Adding also the complex societal relationship among each ethnicity, the poor, the elite, and so on. But without having a caste system where, for instance, the ones that were born in the motherland would be above even the whites that were born in the colonies. And probably also if people were mixed with the whites, they would still be somewhat accepted into this elite. It would be a very different society. At this point, I can't predict whether World War I or World War II would happen, but if Mexico gets independent, they would have to reconciliate with the First Nations and also abolish slavery and let the former slaves participate in politics as well. Surely this would not happen fast and suddenly, so we might have a weak Anglophone Mexico with secessionists, revolutionary movements, not only in California but also in the interior of Mexico, in the mountains, while Quebec might assume the role as a more dominant power of the Americas, or even Portugal could assert themselves and become the most dominant power of the Americas. They could actually fulfill the plans that were already worked out by the monarchy, but that they never really could do because for obvious reasons, where they would have this United Kingdom of Portugal, where you then also have the sub-kingdom of Portugal itself, then the Algarve, then Brazil, and maybe even some African colonies that would have a higher status. So maybe something as Salazar tried to do, like the tropical Lusitanism, could work, where Portugal would then become some type of federal state. Overall, the Brits would have exploited Mexico rather than truly develop it, except for the rich eastern coast and maybe even parts of California. Most of the resources would be exported to Britain, Europe, and nothing or almost nothing would be left in there, leaving an Anglophone Mexico not only divided, but also a very poor one. So to sum it up, an Anglophone Mexico would never really become a US of our timeline. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.